Okay, so in the last video, we looked at building a sort of email reply system with Crew AI, Llama 3, and Groq. And I mentioned at the end that I do something like this in LangGraph. So in this video, I'm going to go into sort of rebuilding and actually making a sort of more advanced version of what we had in Crew AI, but in LangGraph. Okay, so first up, it's important to understand, where does LangGraph actually fit in this sort of ecosystem? So most people know LangChain. So on one side of things, you've got LangChain, which deals with the chains and the prompts and stuff like that. On the other side, you've got fully autonomous agents, which are things kind of like, I guess, Auto GPT. The idea is that the fully autonomous thing can basically do all its planning, do all its tool choice, doing everything like that without you giving it anything in there. And sort of in between these two extremes, you've got LangGraph. So what LangGraph basically does is it gives structure and state so that we can create agents, but in a way that we've got them so we can monitor what's going on. We can basically control their next steps. We can control the whole flow engineering elements that are going on here. And I'll talk about that as we go through. So where does Crew AI fit in? So if we look at Crew AI, it's probably somewhere between sort of LangGraph and fully autonomous agents, in that the agents in Crew AI can make more sort of independent decisions at times, even though Crew AI is written basically on LangGraph and LangChain. But you lose a lot of the control for this. So many people have asked me, like, okay, would I put Crew AI stuff into production? And the answer is no. I would use Crew AI for basically testing ideas out, for getting things going. And then I would convert it to something that's more stable, something more where I've basically got control over the next steps, and I can monitor that and I can guide that so that I know that, okay, I'm not going to be wasting lots of calls doing the same thing over and stuff like that. I can write in the conditional logic that I want to guide and control the flow engineering as it's going through here. Okay, so I've done a whole video about LangGraph before. They have made some changes to the API since then. It's developed quite a bit more, but there's some key concepts that I want to go through here, just because we're going to be talking about these a lot. So you're going to have your chains, which basically the LangChain chains. These are just stringing prompts together, that kind of thing. Also including things like output passes, choosing your language model, that kind of stuff there. You're going to have nodes, which are going to be functions that run chains. You can think of them literally as running chains or running tools. So they can be running things like search, doing things like that. We're going to have edges that's sort of represented here by this red line, which will basically connect nodes together so that we're going from one set of calls to another set of calls. And then we're going to have these conditional edges, which in some ways operate a little bit more like nodes, in that they're a function that kind of decides, okay, which node do we go to next? So you'll see that I use these things for deciding, are we going to basically do some research or we're not going to do some research? Are we going to rewrite an email or we're not going to rewrite an email? These are done with the sort of conditional edges. So the idea here is that we're building a graph of nodes and connecting them via edges. And we've got hardwired edges where this node must go to this next node. And then the other way is we've got conditional edges where from this node, it might go to 1, 2, 3, 4, or variety of number of different nodes in here. Now, the other key thing to understand is the idea of the state. So the state graph, they call it in here. You can think of all of this as kind of like being a big state machine, that you're guiding this sort of flow around a graph, but we're maintaining this state of variables, of what's going on, of what's being updated, that kind of thing. So you'll see in the example that I'm going to go through, I'm going to have a draft email that we're going to save to that state. And then we'll be able to pull it out and access that from other nodes that didn't create that. So your state is what gets passed around from node to conditional edge to node as it goes through. Now, it's really just your set of variables that you've got in there. And there are a number of different tricks that you can do with that. I'm not going to go too in depth into those in this video. I've kept it really simple and just made it so that we're going to access these variables from this. And then from this, we can look at adding more advanced things over time. So what we're going to build here is very similar to what we built with Crew AI last time. We're going to start off with an initial email as an input. We're going to then categorize that email. We're then going to go to a conditional edge. So I've represented these conditional edges here with like diamonds, where it will decide, hey, do we need to do some research for this email or not? Now, in this case, we're going to the web to do some research, but you could imagine that this is going to be a RAG system or something like that. And maybe in a future video, we can actually swap this out for a RAG system and look at how that goes. From there, now, if we don't use the search, either way, we're going to end up at doing this draft email here. So we're either going to go from the conditional edge, deciding, no, we don't need research and just going to the draft, or we're going to go through doing the research, and then we're going to basically automatically go to the draft here. The draft will check to see if there's any research or any documents that it needs to basically write the draft, etc. And if they're there, it will use them. If they're not there, it doesn't need to use them. And the way it's going to access all of that is through the state graph. So for example, as we do the email category, that gets saved back to the state graph as we go through. As we do research, that gets saved back to the state graph. As we come to do the draft, it will load up the email category and the research, use that, and then save the draft back to the state graph in there. From there, we've basically got a simple, again, another conditional edge. And this is kind of doing a little bit of reflection here. So the idea here is that it's going to basically decide if it needs to rewrite this. And actually, if it decides that, yes, it probably should, it then goes off to sort of like an analyzer node, where the node here is going to basically just look at it and make some recommendations for rewriting it, pass those on to rewriting, and then we come up to the final email. If it decides that it doesn't need to be rewritten, it'll just go straight to actually a little node that goes in here, which will basically take the draft email and convert it to be the final email here. So the idea here is that we've got this kind of reflection thing going on. Now, the way I've done it here is very simple. All right, you can certainly play around with this a lot more. You could imagine in this conditional edge here that it checks the email for brand standards, or is it mentioning any other competitors' names or anything wrong that it shouldn't be mentioning, that kind of thing. Now, the way that we're doing this, these can actually be language model calls, like I'm going to show here, but they could also just be like a regex function or something like that in there as well. So you've got a lot of opportunities here of how you guide this flow. And this is the whole sort of idea here, is that we're building a flow of how everything should go. And this is often where you'll spend a lot of time sort of thinking through, okay, I want it to do this step and then this step, and then, gradually go through all the steps till you get your final output here. Now, I will say that in some ways, this is probably overly complicated for just rewriting a simple email. The idea here is I want to basically show you the different sort of examples of conditional edges, show you connecting the nodes together and putting all these things together as we go through this. But it's certainly something that you could take and make much more complicated agents where they've got a variety of different decision points. Now, one of the cool things that you can think about with this is that at any point, it's very limited what it can do. Even though it's like an agent here and it's making decisions, it's not like those decisions can be just totally wild. When it gets to this rewrite part, it can't decide to go back to the researcher. It can't get in this sort of loop of where you've got things just going on again and again because it gets tricked or something like that. Where we've basically conditioned the flow in a way that it can only go in the directions that we're allowing it to go here. And this is one of the big advantages of LangGraph over the sort of like fully autonomous ideas of where you're setting things up and they just go into loops and stuff like that. Those kind of examples, you end up debugging by rewriting your prompts a lot rather than rewriting the structure of the flow. So the reason why I like LangGraph probably more than Crew AI, even though it's going to take a lot more code, is that at any point you can log things out here. You've got full control of what's going on here. And you don't have to worry about getting the exact right prompt to get it to go to the next step. It can only go through flow that you've allowed it to do. Now, I could come here and add in some nodes that go back and recategorize. Of course, I can always do that, but that's my choice to do it rather than just leaving it up to an LLM to decide all these sorts of things. All right, let's jump into the code and get started with this. All right, so let's jump into the code. So you can see that I'm basically just bringing in some of the standard imports like before. Actually, I'm not going to use DuckDuckGo this time. I'm going to use Tivoli Search. But I'm bringing in basically LangChain Groq, which we're going to use for Llama 3. And then we've got the various LangChain imports and LangGraph in here. All right, so the goal here is kind of similar to what we had before. We're going to take an email as input. We're then going to basically categorize it. We're then going to basically pass that category and the initial email to a sort of decider or a router, which is going to decide whether it needs to do some search for it. It will then basically, the search nodes will look at the email, work out the best keywords for the search that relate to that email, do the search, bring all the data back, store that, then use that and the categorized email and the email category to write a draft reply. And then we're going to have another sort of checker, which is going to basically check, does the draft reply need a rewrite or not? So this is kind of a reflection or a recursive improvement sort of step in there. So we didn't have that in the Crew AI version, but we're putting that in here. All right, so you'll see that most of the imports and stuff like that here are pretty standard. We're setting up Llama 370 billion on Groq again, same like we did before. We're going to be using that as a chat model. So to get that to play nicely, we're going to basically be using, the chat prompt templates, etc., that I've got in here. We're also going to have some output parsers. So a lot of the calls we're going to use are going to be JSON. So we want to pass those back as JSON, and some of them are going to be strings. So we're going to pass those back as strings in here. All right, got a little utility function just to write out some of the outputs as we go through to Markdown. It's not really needed. It's more just to be able to see later on what actually happened in your agent as it ran through. All right, so I talked about in the previous part that you've got chains, you've got nodes, you've got, edges, you've got conditional edges in here. The first thing that you want to set up is your chains. So you can see here, I'm going to have a variety of different chains. So I'm going to have a chain to categorize the email. I'm going to have a chain to sort of decide whether we do some research or not. I'm going to have a chain for doing the keywords, for finding the keywords for the research. I'm going to have a chain for writing a draft email. And I'm going to have a chain for checking that email. So that's going to be basically deciding whether we do a rewrite or not. And then if we are going to do some kind of rewrite, we're actually going to have like a self-reflection step. So this is sort of like a draft email analysis step in here. So there's a chain for that. And then rewriting the actual email, there's a chain for that as well. So there are quite a number of chains in here, for doing this. Now, like I mentioned earlier on, this is probably overkill for writing us an email reply to a customer when you come back, right? That's not the sort of main thing I'm trying to show here. I'm trying to show how you can basically put all these things together to actually, build something. So let's go through the chains pretty quickly. You can see that basically just got the chains set up for Llama 3. A lot of these are going to be quite similar. Where I could have basically copied kind of what we were using in Crew AI and brought that across here. So you should see a lot of them will be, kind of similar in here. And then for each chain, the way I do it is basically we set up the chain, then we're going to use LangChain expression language to actually take the chain, join it to the LLM, and then join it to the output parser in here. So this is basically the email category generator kind of thing. And then I'll test it out. Each time I make one of the chains, I basically test it out. So you can see here, I've just made a little email. We run that through and we can see that this email has been categorized as customer feedback in here. All right. The next sort of one is the research router, right? Deciding whether we're going to basically, just write the draft email straight away, or we're going to do some web search and do some search from that through this. Again, we can kind of try this out. Here, obviously, we're now passing in, if you look at our input variables, we're passing in the initial email and the email category. Whereas up here, we were just passing in the initial email, right? And you'll see that as we go through, we're going to pass in, more and more things. All right, the search keywords. So here we're starting to pass in, again, the initial email and the category. And we're going to be basically using this to generate keywords, which are then going to be used to do the search in there. All right, the next chain up is the actual drafting of the email. So in here, we're going to be passing in the initial email, the email category, the research info is going to go into this. The key thing here is that we've got, just some things talking about how to sort of use the category, and you could totally customize all of this. I haven't put a huge amount of effort into the prompting here. I've been more sort of setting up the flow and the structure of the whole thing as it goes through here. But you can see that, okay, we're going to be basically taking this now. On this particular one, you can see we're passing JSON back. And we can see this because we've got our draft writer there. We're going to be passing back JSON. We're going to use a JSON output parser. So to do this, you want to make sure that you've got something like, return the email, a JSON with single key, no preamble or explanation. The parser is actually pretty good at sort of filtering out things like that anyway, as you go through. You can see that, okay, given my sort of initial email that I had above and the category, I've now got this sort of email draft back in JSON. And it turns out that the emails that it comes back with are pretty good, right? So most of the time, it's not going to do a rewrite for this. It's not going to need to do a rewrite. The email will sort of answer everything that was in the initial email and stuff like that. So much so that I'll sort of have to fake a bad email to show you, getting it to do the rewrite. Okay, so next up is basically the rewriter, or the conditional edge prompt for doing the rewriter. So this is deciding here whether it does a rewrite or whether it doesn't do a rewrite. So you can see here, it's going to give a binary choice back of rewrite or no rewrite in here. And you can see that if we run this with a bad email, then it will say rewrite. But you'll see for most of the time when it's generated the draft email itself, you're going to find that it actually is usually not going to want to rewrite it. It's going to be fine with it in here. So this is sort of like, this is a conditional edge to decide if you go into some kind of a Flexian step. I could have just automatically gone in there and gotten the analysis back and done a rewrite. That's something I could have. I wanted to show you another example, though, of using this conditional edge, because the conditional edges are really sort of what makes the agent, very different from the chains, right? The chains are just linked step by step by step kind of thing. These conditional edges are deciding, do I go, this path or do I go this path in here? So here I've got like binary choices in these ones, but you could have like, more than two choices in here. This is certainly something you could do. All right. If it does do a rewrite, it will basically do some analysis of working out, okay, what needs to be changed. And you'll see that actually that will return back JSON. You'll get some issues and stuff like that here. I haven't put a lot of time into doing this. I could actually I've basically specified that it should come back as draft analysis here, but you could actually tell it, what you want the internal parts of that to be, whether it's stuff related to the company, stuff related to the customer, that kind of thing in here. And don't forget, in these things, we could actually, before this, look up the customer's user number and then bring in other information about them and pass that to something like this if we wanted to as well. Don't forget, with this, we're running on the Llama 70B. So this is a model that you could run on-prem if you wanted to run, if you were doing something like that. We've then got basically the rewrite prompt for just rewriting the email. Like I said, most of the time you're going to find it actually doesn't even use this, right? Going through here. All right, setting up the tool for the Tavily search in here. So this is just basically taking LangChain's tool. I'm just returning one example here to keep it nice and short, but you could certainly change this to 3 or to 5 and use that as well, as you've got that in here. All right, so that's all of our sort of prompts taken care of now. The next thing that we want to sort of look at is actually setting up the LangGraph part of this. So the LangGraph part of this is 3 things. We've got the nodes, we've got the edges, both the normal edges and the conditional edges, and we've got the state. So the state is normally the thing you sort of set up first here. So you can see here, we're basically setting up this state. And you can think about these as being the variables that you pass around in here. So we've got like the initial email, email category, draft email, final email, research info. Actually, info needed, I ended up not using that. Number of steps. So I wanted to sort of track the number of steps through. I often find that's useful in agents to just get a sense of like if it got into a loop, if I expect it to be 8 steps in my agent and suddenly I saw like 26 or something, I know that something is going wrong in there. And then we've got some feedback, if we do the feedback in there. All right. So that's our state. That's what's going to get passed around everywhere. So this is just sort of setting up the class. Later on, we'll instantiate this and you'll see that we pass this in to all the nodes as we go through. So let's look at the nodes. We're going to have a categorized email node. We're going to have a research info node. We're going to have a draft email writer node. In fact, we're going to have nodes for almost all of the chains that we created before. Now, there are a couple of chains that we're going to use as conditional edges. And there are a couple of nodes too that I'll talk about that are, that actually not using a prompt. So I'll talk about those as we go through them. So you'll see that like this categorized email is kind of, a good example. You take in the state, you then extract out what you want to use from that state. So at the first off, we're just using the initial email, right? That gets passed into the agent at the start here. Now I've put a lot of print statements around here so you can sort of go through and sort of see, I think at the start, it often can be confusing if you sort of see like, okay, this is being fired when, that kind of thing is helpful. I've got my number of steps just being triggered in there. I've then basically got where I'm firing off the chain, right? So I've got my initial email. I'm passing that into the chain for the email category generator that we saw above. And then in this case, I'm basically printing that out and I'm also writing that to a file so that we can check it later. But obviously the printing and the writing and stuff like that is not needed. You could make each of these things smaller in that way. All right, next up, we've got the search stuff. So this is basically just bringing in the email category, etc., sending those off to get keywords, using those keywords, and then for each of those keywords, we're going to run a search, and we're just going to combine all of these into documents. So if you wanted to swap out sort of a RAG system, this is where you could basically swap out and put your RAG system in here to get things back as well. But you can see that each time we've basically done this query and stuff like that, it's gone through, and then we basically just put them all back into this sort of full searches, and we save that into the state as the research info. So every time you return something like this, it's actually going into the state dict that we had before and that we set up before. So that when another node gets called, like this next, the email draft writer here, it gets passed in the state there. You can see, again, like I'm popping off the number of steps and adding to it so that we're sort of keeping a tally as we go through. But it's also then now gotten the initial email, the email category, and this research. And we can pass all of that into our chain. And we could do a lot more fancy stuff with this as well if we wanted to, before we pass it into the chain. But here we're basically just I'm just taking it, I'm passing them into the chain. We get the draft email back, right? Or this email draft back. I write it to a file, but I also then pass it onto the dict, right? So that on the state dict is now going to basically have the draft email as well as the other things that we've put in there as well. All right, next up, we've got, the analyzing the draft. This is going to be doing the same. It pulls out what it needs, calls the chain, it brings things back, in this case, writing to a file, but then more importantly, returning it and writing it to the state dict in here. So you've got a bunch of them that are like that. The two ones that are different is that if we don't do a rewrite, we've only got the state dict is basically saved the draft email. We don't have a final email. So this one is literally just to basically take the draft email and then save it out to the final email so that we can get it off that way. And I'm just putting in it that it's another step. It's not really, I guess, a step of an LLM call in there. And then the other one that I put in here, again, more for just debugging, is this idea of a state printer. So that when you're sort of building these things, you kind of want to know as you're going along, okay, am I am I actually putting the right things into the right places on the state dictionary or not, right? So I can sort of put this at various places and then see the outputs. It will print out the outputs in here. So you'll see, I'll show you some examples of this, and I'll talk about sort of like as I'm building it, I'm kind of using this quite a bit as like the endpoint to just sort of see like, okay, did the last step do what I thought it's going to do? Okay, that's working now. Let's move on to the next node kind of thing. All right, the conditional edges are where you've got this idea of it's now going to, it's finished in this case with the email category, and it's now going to basically do a decision whether it routes it to the research or just straight to the draft the email kind of thing. So the way to do this is we're passing these two things into that chain, which is the research router, and it will return back a JSON object, which we can look at the router decision in there. And that router decision is either going to be research info or draft email in here. Now, if you were using a model that's not as good as this model, then you probably want to do some more checking and just make sure that you're only getting these two responses back. And if you get an error, perhaps recall the chain, right, for this. But in this case, we're either going to get back research info, we're going to get back draft email, and then you'll see that that's going to then determine what we go to next. The same with this conditional edge for routing, whether we do a rewrite or don't do a rewrite. So you can see that to get it to do a rewrite, I've actually put in like a sort of fake draft email that sort of is so bad that it causes it to do a rewrite in here. Otherwise, most of the time, it's going to be quite happy with the actual email that it wrote at the start in there. All right, so those are our nodes and our conditional edges. Now we need to start assembling all of this. So to assemble this, you basically instantiate the state graph, right? So that's going to, that's going to hold everything. And most importantly, it's holding your variables in there. But we're also going to add all the nodes to it, and we're going to add the edges to it as well. So you can see here, once we've instantiated this, we add each node, and we've basically got the name of the node and then the function that it actually, points to. So we've defined all those above. We've got the names of each of these, and then just defining, where they actually point to up here. And then for edges, we generally, let me look at just the sort of standard edge first, is where this is like a hardwired edge, meaning that analyze draft email after that always has to go to rewrite email. It can't go somewhere else. This is what we talk about sort of controlling the flow, all right? The flow engineering here of engineering that, okay, it's only going to go from here to here, right? Now, so that's like a standard edge. Now there's an entry edge where you just put the first node that you're going to start off at. And then the ones that are actually more complicated are these conditional edges. So the conditional edges, you can see here, we're taking we're going to go, we start categorize email, but then we're going to go from categorize email to a conditional edge. And what that is just telling us that, okay, this categorize email is going to go to this conditional edge, which is the function, is the route to research or not, right? So it's making a decision. And if the decision comes back research info, it will then go to the research info search node, right? Which is this here. And we can see that one is hardwired to draft email writer there. If it doesn't come back research info, if it comes back draft email, then it will just automatically just go to draft email writer. And then this edge is not even used. So this is a conditional edge that you need to set up. So you basically take the node that it was coming from, and you've got the conditional edge, which will make the decision which node it goes to next in here. So I've got two conditional edges, one for deciding about the research and one for deciding about doing the rewriting in here. So that's the one that we've got going on here. Now you'll see that I basically come out of this sort of, we end up with either the writing, the analyze the draft email and do a rewrite, and then from rewrite to the state printer, or we go out with no rewrite, and from no rewrite, we go to the state printer. So they both converge back in on the sort of state printer, which is just there for us to be able to see, what the actual variables were. When you're building this, you might first just start off with like 2 nodes. And so you want to define that like it goes from node 1 to node 2, and then from node 2 to the end, or this is why I put the state printer in there, just so that you can then easily see, did everything get set the way you thought it was going to get set, so that you can sort of look at that as it's coming out. Finally, you want to come to an end node in here. So here, no matter what, we end up going to the state printer, and then the state printer is hardwired to go to the end node, which basically just stops everything that we've got in there. All right. Once we've got this workflow sort of set up, which is basically set up our entire sort of graph now, we can just compile that as an app, and now we can use it. So here you can see I'm passing in an email. If okay, my inputs are going to be the initial email, and then I'm just going to pass in the number of steps equals 0 and research info equals none. So, you want to, anything that you need to set at the start, you basically set here, and you then invoke this. Now, here is doing a stream version of it, but if I come down here, you can see this is doing it just the invoke way. Now, if we just invoke it and we look at the outputs, we're going to get output back, and we want to see the final email. We can see, there you go. That's our final email that we're going to get in here. If we actually print this as we're going through and look what's happening. All right, let's come in here. And so I'm just going to take this email. Let's start off and run. And you'll see it's starting off, and first off, it's doing the categorization of email. It's then basically doing the decision that it needs to do, making the decision that it needs to do some research. We can then see that it does the research in here. And then we can see that, okay, it's basically drafted a reply back in here. It's then decided that it doesn't need to do a rewrite. And so it goes through, it finishes that off. And then finally, it basically just allocates in this no rewrite part, it just allocates that to the final email. And we go to the state printer, where in the state printer, we actually just see everything printed out. So we've got our initial email there. We've got the email category that this was a customer complaint. We've got the draft email there, and then we've got the final email. Now, in this case, both of them are the same because there was no rewriting done in there. And if we look in here, we can see all the data that came from the search that we got before. In this case, we can see that, okay, number of steps was 4 here. All right, if we come up here and just make it so we're going to overwrite the draft email that gets sent in there, and we remake the graph, this time we should see it actually go through the rewriting as well, because that email is, it's not good enough. We can see, okay, that this is, we can see it's done the categorization. We can see it's done the draft here. We can see that, okay, so the draft email here was actually the good one that it wrote, but we kind of overwrote that as we passed that into the rewriting one. So let's see, did it do a rewrite? Yes, we can see up here that, okay, it's done, it's decided to rewrite that email because it didn't like it. Remember that I've overwritten this one. It's not this one that's being rewritten. It's the one that I've just uncommented there that got rewritten. See, then it basically went through the draft email analyzer. It used that to rewrite the email. If we come down and look at the final email out, you'll see that actually they often end up being kind of similar. So here, the good draft email that it wrote was, "Hi, George, thank you for reaching out to us about the weather at the resort. I'm sorry to hear it didn't meet your expectations." Here, the final one is, "Hi, George, I'm sorry to hear that the weather at the resort didn't meet your expectations," right? So it is kind of funny that like they end up being, sort of the same thing. So it does show that like the actual draft emails that it's writing are, pretty good. So most of the time it's not going to need the rewriting part in here. And obviously the only reason we've got it is because I uncommented this. All right, so where do you go from here? You can see that basically we had this, initial email category. We've gone through, we've had each of these being nodes, and these diamonds are being the conditional edges that we've got in there. So you could come through and customize this whole thing and build something totally different with this and try out, a bunch of the things. As long as you remember, first write your sort of prompts or your chains in there, working out. In fact, actually, first you should probably write your flow, right? Diagram out exactly what you want to do here. Now, we could have had loops going back in here. That's something that we certainly can do with this. Just be careful, though, that if you've got a loop, you want to make sure that you're not going to get stuck in that loop and it just goes round and round and round. Especially if you're paying for those API calls or something, you don't want to be in that scenario. But the key thing here is that you could take this and sort of customize it to do a whole bunch of different things. And so, like I said before, if you've got any comments or questions, please put them in the comments below. If you found the video useful, please click like and subscribe, and I will talk to you in the next video. Bye for now.